Throughout history, power has often been maintained not only through armies, laws, or faith, but through fear. And nothing inspires fear more deeply, more viscerally, than the sight of a human body being broken by the machinery of justice. In every civilization, from the marble arenas of Rome to the palace courts of Persia, from the vast dynasties of China to the shadowed dungeons of medieval Europe, punishments were not only about discipline, they were performances, theatre for the masses, warnings carved in blood and screams. Today we venture into the darkest corridors of the human past to explore the brutal punishments designed to terrify, to control, and to enforce order. This is not the story of criminals alone, but of emperors and kings, of judges and inquisitors, of societies that believed the body itself was the canvas upon which justice, or vengeance, should be written. But before we descend into the specifics, the crosses of Rome, the scaphism of Persia, the slow slicing of China, and the iron racks of medieval Europe, we must understand the world that created them. Because punishments, as horrifying as they were, did not emerge in a vacuum. They were products of their time, reflections of culture, religion, and political necessity. From the dawn of civilization, punishment was both practical and symbolic. In small tribal societies, wrongdoers could be expelled or executed with little ceremony. But as cities grew, as states rose, and as rulers needed to govern tens of thousands or even millions, the role of punishment changed. It was no longer just about the individual crime. It was about sending a message. In ancient Mesopotamia, nearly 4,000 years ago, King Hammurabi's famous code etched punishments into stone tablets. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Yet these were not simply legal guidelines. They were a way of saying, justice belongs to the state, and vengeance will be carried out under the ruler's authority. By the time of Rome, Persia, and China, the state itself had become a stage, and punishment a public ritual. Executions were not tucked away behind closed doors. They were displayed before thousands, in arenas, on city walls, or in marketplaces. The crowd did not avert its eyes, it leaned in. Why? Because fear was power. If the fate of one condemned man could dissuade hundreds from disobedience, then cruelty became a tool of stability. Punishment was not only political, it was also spiritual. In many ancient cultures, the law was seen as an extension of the god's will. To defy the law was not merely to insult a king, it was to rebel against the divine order of the universe. In Persia, under the Achaemenid kings, executions often carried religious undertones. Heresy or sacrilege could lead to punishments that seemed designed not just to kill, but to obliterate the soul's chance at peace. In medieval Europe, punishments were inseparable from Christianity. Tortures were justified as purifying the sinner, rooting out heresy, or demonstrating the consequences of straying from God's path. To suffer in this life, some argued, might spare the soul eternal damnation. And in China, under the dynasties that stretched across millennia, Confucian ideals of order and hierarchy combined with legalist traditions of strict control. Punishment was a way to restore harmony, not mercy, but balance. The body of the criminal was sacrificed to preserve the stability of the empire. Public punishments were also a form of entertainment. In Rome, executions were woven into the gladiatorial games. The condemned might be thrown to wild beasts, burned, or forced into rigged battles they could not win. To the roaring crowd, these deaths were both warning and spectacle, a day at the arena that reminded them of Rome's absolute power. In medieval towns, execution days were community events. People gathered at gallows, scaffold, or stake. Children watched. Vendors sold food. Jesters mocked the condemned. And as the axe fell or the flames rose, the crowd witnessed justice served, sometimes with cheers, sometimes with silence, but always with memory. The condemned body became a living billboard. A man broken on the wheel, left to rot for days, was a message. Defy the law, and this is your fate. The question lingers. Why were punishments so unimaginably cruel? Why crucifixion, scaphism, boiling, flaying, or the dreaded Chinese lingchi, the death by 1,000 cuts? The answer lies in the fragility of power. Ancient and medieval rulers faced rebellions, conspiracies, and crimes that threatened the very structure of their states. Law enforcement as we know it today, police, prisons, surveillance, did not exist. Fear had to fill the gap. A thief in Rome might steal once, but his crucifixion on the roadside would deter hundreds more. A traitor in Persia could be smeared with honey and devoured by insects, not only as punishment, but as a terrifying fable retold for generations. A heretic in medieval Europe, burned at the stake, sent a message to all who doubted the Church's authority. Cruelty was not random. It was calculated, a carefully engineered instrument of control. And so, in this series of stories, we will travel from empire to empire, dungeon to dungeon, exploring the punishments that defined civilizations. We will walk the blood-stained roads of Rome, where crucifixion became both terror and theology. We will descend into the courts of Persia, where an execution called scaphism turned a human body into a living feast for insects. We will cross into China, where dynastic law perfected punishment so slow and surgical that they seemed designed to unmake humanity itself. And we will wander the castles and squares of medieval Europe, where the rack, the wheel, and the stake stood as icons of justice and faith. This is not a story for the faint of heart, but it is a story we must tell, because to understand the brutality of the past is to understand the forces that shaped our present. For in every lash of the whip, every turn of the wheel, every scream that echoed across the square, we find not only cruelty but the anatomy of power. We begin in Rome. The empire that gave us roads, aqueducts, and architecture of breathtaking scale was also a civilization that perfected the art of punishment as theatre. Rome was a state that understood spectacle, bread and circuses, games and gladiators, and its punishments were no exception. Of all Rome's punishments, none is more infamous than crucifixion. It was a method designed not for efficiency, but for maximum suffering and maximum display. The condemned man was not merely killed, he was dismantled, slowly, in plain view of all. The process began with scourging. Whips tipped with fragments of bone or metal tore strips of flesh from the victim's back. Already weakened, bleeding, and trembling, the condemned was then forced to carry the heavy crossbeam of his own execution device through the streets, paraded as an example. At the place of execution, often a busy roadside or hill outside the city, the cross awaited. The victim was stripped naked, humiliated, and nailed or tied to the wood. Nails through the wrists and feet, piercing nerves and bone, sent waves of agony through the body. Hanging in this position, breathing became a torture. Each inhalation required pushing against pierced feet or dragging against torn wrists. Death did not come quickly. Hours, sometimes days, exposure, dehydration, birds pecking at the flesh. The victim's slow collapse became a public warning. Defy Rome, and this is your fate. Crucifixion was reserved for slaves, rebels, and the lowest criminals, not Roman citizens, who were considered too honorable for such a fate. The sheer cruelty of this punishment was a way to underline Rome's absolute hierarchy. Masters over slaves, empire over rebels, Rome over all. Perhaps the most famous crucifixion in history is that of Jesus of Nazareth, around the year 30 CE. His death became the cornerstone of Christianity, transforming Rome's instrument of terror into a symbol of redemption. But in its own time, crucifixion was anything but redemptive. It was horror elevated to ritual. Beyond crucifixion, Rome used its arenas as both court and execution ground. Condemned criminals, called noxi, were often executed during the intermissions of gladiatorial games. But these executions were not simple hangings or beheadings. They were staged as dramatic spectacles, blending theatre with death. A criminal might be dressed as a mythological figure, say Orpheus or Prometheus, and then killed in a reenactment of the myth. Prometheus, chained and torn by an eagle, was not an actor in these plays. He was a real man, condemned, his screams providing the audience with both entertainment and warning. Others were condemned ad bestias, to the beasts. Thrown naked into the arena, they faced lions, leopards, or bears. Some were mauled in seconds, others survived longer, scrambling desperately as the crowd roared. The message was simple. Rome had power over man and beast alike, and the condemned were less than either. It is easy to imagine the Colosseum as a place of heroic combat, but for many it was a place of one-sided slaughter, where punishment and entertainment became indistinguishable. One of the most chilling examples of Roman punishment as warning came in the aftermath of the Spartacus rebellion. In 71 BCE, after years of rebellion led by the gladiator Spartacus, the Roman general Crassus finally crushed the uprising. 6,000 captured rebels were condemned, not to quick death in battle, but to crucifixion along the Appian Way, the great road leading from Capua to Rome. For miles, crosses lined the road. 6,000 bodies left to hang, rot, and decay in the sun. A living wall of terror, stretching farther than the eye could see. This was Rome's message carved into the landscape. Rebellion will not be tolerated. The cost of defying the empire is written in blood and nailed to wood. From Rome we turn east to Persia. The Persian empires, first the Achaemenid dynasty, then the Sassanids, spanned vast territories, from the Mediterranean to the Indus Valley. To hold such a realm together required not just administration, but fear. Persian punishments, like Rome's, were both practical and theatrical, but often carried an added layer of ritual and spiritual dread. Perhaps the most notorious of all Persian punishments was scaphism. Described by later Greek writers, scaphism was reserved for the most hated criminals, often traitors. The condemned was trapped between two boats or hollowed-out logs, leaving only the head, hands, and feet exposed. Then the process began. Milk and honey were forced into the victim's mouth until they vomited. More honey was smeared on the face, the limbs, the exposed flesh. The person was then left afloat in stagnant water, a human feast for insects. Flies, wasps, and beetles swarmed. Days passed. The body swelled, blistered, and festered with infection. Some accounts claim victims lingered for over a week, consumed alive by the slow work of nature, their screams echoing across the marshes. Scaphism was more than execution. It was annihilation, designed to erase the body's dignity and transform it into decay while still alive. The cruelty was so great that many historians wonder if Greek writers exaggerated it, but the very fact it was told, retold, and feared speaks to Persia's reputation for dreadful justice. Other Persian punishments were equally brutal. The impalement stake, forcing a sharpened pole through the body and leaving the victim upright, was practiced to terrify rebels. Victims could remain alive for hours, even days, skewered and writhing while onlookers shuddered. Another method was the tower, or pit, where criminals were trapped without food, slowly starving as their punishment was drawn out. Unlike swift executions, these punishments emphasized not just death, but prolonged suffering. And always they were public. Spectators bore witness. Rumors carried the stories across the empire. The terror did not stop with the condemned. It spread like wildfire, ensuring obedience. What made Persian punishments distinct was their connection to Zoroastrian beliefs. In Zoroastrianism, purity and impurity were central concepts. Criminals who betrayed the empire were seen as agents of impurity, threatening the cosmic order of Asha, truth and righteousness. Thus, punishments were not only justice, they were purification. By subjecting a traitor to scaphism or impalement, the Persians symbolically expelled corruption from the empire. It was brutal theology, carved into human flesh. Rome and Persia, though enemies on the battlefield, shared a chilling philosophy: punishment as spectacle. Rome nailed rebels to crosses and fed criminals to beasts, while Persia smeared traitors with honey and let them rot in swamps. Both understood that cruelty was not wasted, it was invested. Each scream became a currency of control, each corpse a reminder of the state's dominance. And yet, both empires also revealed a contradiction. For all their power, for all their brutality, both Rome and Persia would eventually fall. Their punishments brought fear, but not immortality. Still, the memory of their methods lingered. Rome gave us the image of crucifixion, an image so powerful it became the core of a global religion. Persia gave us tales of scaphism, stories retold for centuries as the epitome of cruelty. But our journey does not end here. For in the East, China was crafting punishments as intricate as its bureaucracy, as refined as its philosophy, and as merciless as any devised in Rome or Persia. And in Europe's medieval era, iron and fire would become the instruments of both justice and faith. Join me as we turn now to China and the Middle Ages, two worlds where punishment became not just spectacle, but a science of suffering. As Rome and Persia wielded the cross and the stake, far to the east another empire was shaping its own philosophy of law and punishment. China, with its millennia of dynastic rule, developed methods of discipline as vast and varied as the empire itself. Here, the body of the criminal was not only a vessel of suffering, but also a mirror of cosmic balance. And centuries later, in the castles and cathedrals of medieval Europe, punishment took on a new form, rooted in the fires of faith, sharpened on the iron of torture devices, and performed in public squares where salvation and damnation seemed to hang on the turn of a wheel. China's legal traditions were forged in a crucible of competing philosophies. Confucianism emphasized harmony, hierarchy, and filial duty. Legalism, by contrast, advocated strict laws and harsh penalties, believing fear was the only way to ensure obedience. Together, they shaped a society where punishments were not accidental cruelties, but deliberate tools of governance. Every dynasty refined its penal codes. The Tang Code of the 7th century CE, for example, categorized crimes and punishments with meticulous precision. Floggings, banishments, strangulations, and beheadings all carefully prescribed. But when crimes were deemed especially heinous, treason, parricide, rebellion, punishments took on a darker, almost ritualistic cruelty. The most infamous of China's punishments was lingchi, literally, the slow process, often called death by 1,000 cuts. Lingchi was not simply execution, it was unmaking. The condemned was tied to a wooden frame, arms outstretched. Before the gathered crowd, the executioner began cutting. Small slices at first, from the flesh of the chest, the limbs, the face. Each cut inflicted pain, humiliation, and horror. As the body weakened, larger pieces of flesh were removed, until finally the throat was cut, or the heart pierced, ending the ordeal. Accounts describe executions lasting hours. In the Ming dynasty, officials recorded cases where hundreds of cuts were administered. The victim was conscious for much of it, enduring a death that seemed designed to erase the human form itself. Lingchi was reserved for the gravest crimes: treason, parricide, offenses that threatened the very order of heaven and earth. It was not just about death, it was about dishonor. The body, mutilated beyond recognition, was denied the integrity needed for the afterlife. For a society steeped in ancestor worship and the sanctity of the body, this was punishment beyond the grave. Photographs from the final decades of lingchi, before it was abolished in 1905, reveal the horror: blurred faces of victims, torn flesh, crowds watching in solemn silence. The punishment lived on not only in Chinese memory but in the imaginations of the West, becoming a byword for cruelty itself. Another hallmark of Chinese justice was collective punishment. A criminal's family, clan, or associates could be punished alongside him. A traitor might see not only his own death, but the execution of his parents, his children, even his servants. Entire households could be wiped out, their names stricken from records, their property seized. The logic was chilling but effective. A man considering rebellion knew that he risked not only his own life, but the annihilation of everyone he loved. In this way, the state bound obedience not with chains, but with fear of devastating loss. Beyond lingchi and collective reprisals, Chinese dynasties employed a range of brutal penalties, flogging and beating with bamboo canes, often to the point of crippling injury, amputation or mutilation, branding criminals as permanent outcasts, kangs, heavy wooden collars that immobilized the neck and shoulders, forcing the criminal to endure days of public humiliation. Execution by strangulation or beheading, often performed before large crowds as both justice and instruction. China's punishments reflected its imperial order, vast, methodical, unflinching. The condemned body was both a warning to the living and a symbol of cosmic balance restored. As dynasties rose and fell in China, Europe entered the Middle Ages, a world of castles, cathedrals, and feudal lords. Here, punishment was inseparable from faith. The Church shaped not only the soul's salvation, but also the body's suffering. Crime was not just against the king or the law, it was against God. Punishment, therefore, carried both earthly pain and eternal significance. To burn a heretic was not only to silence dissent, but to demonstrate divine wrath. To torture a suspected witch was not only to extract confession, but to cleanse the community of Satan's influence. One of the most feared instruments of medieval punishment was the rack, a wooden frame, rollers at each end, ropes fastened to wrists and ankles. As the rollers turned, the victim's body was stretched taut, joints straining, muscles tearing. Bones could dislocate, ligaments snap, until the body became a grotesque parody of itself. The rack was often used not for execution, but for interrogation. Its goal was confession. Under unbearable agony, men and women admitted to crimes, real or imagined, their words scribbled down as proof. The paradox was brutal. Torture produced answers, but not always truth. Another infamous punishment was the breaking wheel, used across much of continental Europe. The condemned was tied to a cartwheel laid flat on the ground. Then, with a heavy iron bar or hammer, the executioner smashed the limbs one by one. Bones cracked, flesh split, screams echoed. Once broken, the shattered body was woven between the spokes of the wheel and hoisted upright for all to see. Death could take hours, even days. Birds pecked at the exposed flesh. Passers-by saw the twisted form silhouetted against the sky, a grim reminder of law's reach. For heresy, witchcraft, and crimes against faith, fire was the chosen punishment. The condemned was bound to a wooden stake, a pyre built at their feet. As flames rose, smoke choked the lungs, skin blistered, and the body was consumed. Burnings were public, often attended by thousands. In England, Marian persecutions under Queen Mary I saw nearly 300 Protestants burned alive in the 1550s. In France and Germany, accused witches met the same fate. And across Europe, the fire became both punishment and purification, a ritual of both death and damnation. The Middle Ages saw a dizzying variety of punishments. The Iron Maiden, a coffin-like device lined with spikes, though its historical use may have been exaggerated. The pillory, where offenders were locked in wooden frames, pelted with rotten food, stones, or worse. Boiling alive, used occasionally for crimes like poisoning, plunging the condemned into vats of oil or water. hanging, drawing, and quartering, the dreaded fate of traitors in England, where the body was hanged, disemboweled, and dismembered in ritual sequence. Each method had its logic. Some punished swiftly, others slowly. Some humiliated, others annihilated. Together, they reflected a society where law, faith, and fear were inseparable. In China, punishments like lingchi and collective reprisals enforced imperial order with terrifying precision. In Europe, torture and execution dramatized the power of both church and crown. Both societies saw the body as a canvas upon which justice was carved. Both relied on spectacle, on the public gaze, on the memory of pain to secure obedience, and in both, cruelty was justified not as excess, but as necessity. The empire must endure, the faith must be preserved, the law must be obeyed. Yet even as punishments grew more elaborate, whispers of doubt arose. Philosophers, theologians, and common folk alike began to ask, is there no limit? Must justice always be written in blood? That question would come to shape the aftermath, the significance, and the legacy of these brutal practices. We have walked the roads of Rome, where crosses lined the horizon with bodies broken by nails. We have floated with Persia's condemned, smeared with honey, and devoured by insects. We have stood before the wooden frames of China, where flesh was sliced piece by piece, and we have heard the screams of medieval Europe's wheel and rack. But what became of these punishments? Did they vanish with the fall of empires, or do their echoes still shape our world today? To answer that, we must turn to the aftermath, the significance, and the legacy of this long history of pain. By the late Middle Ages and into the early modern period, change was stirring. Across Europe, thinkers of the Renaissance and Enlightenment began questioning whether cruelty was truly the foundation of justice. Philosophers like Cesare Beccaria, in his 1764 treatise on crimes and punishments, argued that punishments should be proportionate, rational, and humane. He condemned torture as both immoral and ineffective. And in China, by the dawn of the 20th century, the Qing dynasty abolished lingchi, recognizing that such punishments were relics of a fading past. In Persia, too, the rituals of scaphism and impalement gave way to more standardized forms of justice as dynasties rose and fell. Public executions did not disappear overnight. In fact, they lingered long into modern times. Beheadings in France continued until the guillotine's final fall in 1977. But the age of punishment as mass spectacle slowly faded. Where once tens of thousands gathered to watch, the gallows and the guillotine were eventually tucked away, hidden from public view. Society had changed. The stage of justice was no longer the marketplace or the arena. It was the courtroom and the prison. But why do these brutal punishments matter? They reveal how societies understood power. For Rome, crucifixion was about hierarchy. Slaves and rebels displayed as warnings that Rome's order was unshakable. For Persia, scaphism and impalement symbolized purification, casting traitors as vermin to be consumed by nature itself. For China, lingchi embodied the philosophy of harmony and dishonor, dissecting not only the body, but the soul. For medieval Europe, torture and fire were entwined with faith, demonstrating divine authority on earth. In every case, punishment was not random cruelty. It was language. The lash, the nail, the flame, the blade, all were words in the grammar of power. They told stories of loyalty and rebellion, purity and corruption, salvation and damnation. And those stories shaped history. Rebellions crushed, heresies silenced, dynasties preserved, all secured through the theater of pain. Of course, behind the symbolism was the human cost. The 6,000 rebels crucified along Rome's Appian Way were not symbols to their families. They were fathers, sons, brothers. The victims of lingchi were not merely traitors to the empire. They were flesh and blood, enduring agony beyond comprehension. The women burned as witches in Europe were often the poor, the marginalized, the powerless, consumed not by Satan's fire, but by fear and superstition. Each punishment was a story of power, yes, but also of suffering. And in remembering them, we honor not only the history of states, but the memory of the individuals whose bodies bore the weight of justice. The brutality of ancient and medieval punishments set the stage for their eventual rejection. By the 18th and 19th centuries, new ideas of human rights and dignity emerged. In Europe, the Enlightenment demanded reform. Public executions were increasingly seen as barbaric spectacles, unworthy of civilized nations. Torture was outlawed in many states. Prisons replaced scaffolds as the main site of punishment, ironically trading physical torment for the slow punishment of confinement and isolation. In China, the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911 and the pressures of modernization brought further reforms. The spectacle of lingchi gave way to firing squads and prisons. In Persia, modern Iran abolished many medieval practices as it sought to join the community of modern states. The United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948 declared torture a violation of fundamental dignity, a direct response to the long history of cruelty that had scarred humanity. And yet, the echoes remain. Public executions still occur in parts of the world. Torture, though outlawed, still lurks in prisons and wars. The language of punishment carved into bodies thousands of years ago still resonates in our fears and imaginations. Even in popular culture, the crucifixion, the rack, the wheel, and the guillotine appear in films, novels, and games. They fascinate us, horrify us, remind us of the thin line between justice and cruelty. We may believe ourselves distant from Rome's crosses or China's execution grounds, but the fascination with punishment, with spectacle, with the body as a vessel of power, has never truly left. So what is the legacy of these brutal punishments? First, they teach us the depth of human cruelty, the extremes to which societies will go to secure obedience. They remind us that civilization does not always mean compassion, and that progress often walks hand in hand with blood. Second, they reveal how fragile power can be. The empires of Rome, Persia, China, and medieval Europe wielded punishments as weapons, but none endured forever. Fear may secure obedience for a time, but it cannot halt the turning of history. Third, they warn us. The same justifications used for crucifixion, for lingchi, for burning at the stake. That punishment is necessary, that cruelty is justified, that fear maintains order, can always return if vigilance fails. The history of brutal punishment is not only behind us, it is a shadow at our side, reminding us of what humanity is capable of, both in cruelty and in reform. From the crosses of Rome to the marshes of Persia, from the execution grounds of China to the dungeons of medieval Europe, punishments were more than justice. They were theatre. They were warnings. They were the handwriting of power upon the human body. Today we recoil from their cruelty, yet we must remember them. Because in their pain we see the story of power, of fear, of human control over human flesh. And we see, too, the triumph of those who rose against it, the philosophers who argued for mercy, the reformers who abolished torture, the societies that turned from spectacle to rights. The wheel, the rack, the stake, the 1,000 cuts, these instruments of terror belong to history. But the lesson they teach us is eternal, that justice without humanity becomes cruelty, that order without compassion becomes tyranny. And so, as we leave behind the shadow of Rome, Persia, China, and medieval Europe, we carry forward a question that still matters today. When the state punishes, does it uphold justice, or does it merely display its power? The answer, perhaps, lies not in the screams of the past, but in the choices we make for the future.